you know who I am. I'm Chris Berzins, Director in the Economic Division here in the P Branch. We're very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Carolyn Sullivan, who's very generously agreed to talk to us, as you know, about how to cope with working and having kids at home and at the same time. And as our ADM, Alyssa, put it in a meeting earlier this week that I thought was pretty apt. She said, remember always that you're not teleworking from home right now. You are at home in a crisis trying to work. And I think actually it's one of Caroline's lines as well. So in any event, just very quickly, Carolyn is a professor at the University of Ottawa of psychology and a practicing psychologist. She's founder and director of the Child, Adolescent, and Family Center of Ottawa, has a lot of experience in child and family psychology. And I think what we will do is have Carolyn present to us, and then along the way, if you have questions, just flag it by raising your hand. And then Carolyn will also stop occasionally to check if folks have questions. And then if we have time towards the end, we can do a bit of a round. So again, thank you so much, Carolyn, and welcome.
Thank you, and it's my pleasure. So good morning, everybody. It really is my pleasure to come talk to you because we're all experiencing a pretty challenging time and something we've never quite seen before. So I'm happy to relay what I know, what the research tells us about kids' development, how they're faring during this time, to validate some of the experiences, to share some of the things I'm hearing in my practice and through our clinic, and also to give you some really concrete tips on things, pretty simple things, but concrete things that hopefully might be helpful to you. So overall, we are hearing from families that in general, families are really struggling during this time and the reality of COVID-19 and trying to support their children while working at home. So in terms of balancing, work and taking care of kids and supporting them with their schooling, which is almost over for the year, but also in terms of supporting our kids' emotional well-being, because they're certainly feeling and experiencing some of the things that we are, just in different ways. So kids experience things quite differently. I think most recently with school being canceled for the rest of the year, and which I think for some families came as a bit of a shock, especially as Quebec was opening. There's sort of a real sense of despair for a lot of families, and how am I going to make it to there? How am I going to make it through the summer without camps, without much support, and not knowing when this might end and what September might look like, right, in terms of school for kids and daycares, if they're going to be working normally come the fall. So a lot of this comes with uncertainty, I think, for families in terms of, not knowing when we're going to go back to normal. And it's very hard to tolerate uncertainty for a lot of us, and especially when we're trying to support children at home as well. So obviously, I don't know who's out there who's listening to me. So I'm going to try to give tips that are really applicable to all kinds of families, whether you're, in a co-parent situation, whether there's two parents at home, whether both parents are working or only one is working, if you're parenting in two homes and you have shared custody, for example, if you're a single home. I'm really hoping that these tools I'm going to talk to you about are helpful for all of you. And again, I'll do my best to answer questions as we go. La présentation est en anglais, mais je suis parfaitement bilingue, donc ça me ferait plaisir de répondre à des questions en français si vous en avez. Little caveat, which is if you see me out and about with my kids, don't judge me. I always like to put that in there because when you have all the theory in the world, at the end of the day, we're all human and we're doing the best we can, right? So I'll share with you some of my own struggles with my two kids who are 11 or 12 almost and 9. And how some of the tips I found that helpful as well, but some of the struggles that I'm having also. So we're all doing the best we can. A lot of you are listening to videos all day, so I see that most of you have your videos closed, which is great. I think sometimes listening to some of these things more like a podcast style is good because Zoom fatigue is a real thing. So I'm glad to see that many of you have done that. So overall, what I'm hearing is sort of two of the main challenges families are facing are, on the one hand, trying to balance, work and family life and supporting the kids. But another thing I'm hearing a lot is how to manage different children's behaviors. So from the very young all the way through to the teen years, we're seeing behaviors in our kids that maybe we haven't seen before, that we're not really sure how to manage. And I would say from what I'm hearing, those are the two, and I've done a few of these types of webinars and I've done polls, and it seems to me that those are sort of the two major things that parents are struggling with. So I'm going to try to address those. So the first thing I was going to talk about was a little bit what do we know about how kids are being affected by this pandemic? I think it's, we're all in survival mode right now as adults, and we can kind of understand and rationalize that this is sort of temporary, that we will get through it. We might feel more or less safe in the precautions that we're taking. But I think it's important to remember that for our children, this is really probably the greatest trauma that they've actually lived through. And I think we can forget that sometimes, just because for us, it's sort of, we've adapted now, we're coping. But if we really think about our kids, many of our children, most of the children in Ottawa, really, they're going through a collective trauma. And there's a lot of grief that comes with that. So our kids are just to not minimize what they're experiencing. For most of them, this is the greatest trauma they've seen and they've lived through. So there was a survey done actually at the end of April, looking at Ontarians and how they're coping and how they're doing. So I'm just going to kind of summarize it for you to show you that the impact is real. So this was a child, youth, adult mental health addiction survey that was done on COVID-19. And what they found was that since COVID-19, about 60% of parents are describing noticeable changes in their children's behavior, ranging from outbursts to extreme irritability, drastic changes in mood and behavior and personality. We're seeing difficulties with sleeping, alternate sleeping patterns. We're seeing a lot of teenagers who have turned nocturnal. I don't know if some of you are experiencing that, where really they're up all night and sleeping during the day. Some kids are experiencing persistent sadness as well. And about 30% of children and teenagers are reporting significant increases in stress levels. So overall, we're looking at about 50% of Ontarians saying that their mental health has decreased and deteriorated since COVID-19 began. And obviously this comes with some, bad habits or coping mechanisms that are perhaps not the most positive. So we are seeing a lot more increase in screen time use, of course. So adults and kids actually playing more video games, computer games, spending more time on their phone or tablets, upwards of 50 to 60% more than usual. Less exercise, eating less well, potentially using more alcohol or drugs as well. So we're really looking at a spike in families who are experiencing and feeling stress, and some to the point where they feel like they can't cope or deal with things. And it's a reality that a lot of us are living, because in many ways we feel like we're failing at everything, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But at the end of a day, when we're getting into bed at night and we're looking back on our day, we feel like we weren't available enough as a parent. Perhaps we weren't able to give them enough support with their school. We feel like we weren't productive enough at work because we were interrupted constantly. We couldn't focus. And things like that. And that's a real crummy way to go to bed, right? And to think about yourself at the end of the day. So this is a common experience that a lot of people are reporting. So what do we do with that? Well, with kids in particular, I think it's important to think of their behavior as their form of communication. And this is as young as toddlers, actually. Kids will express themselves to us through their behavior. Not a lot of kids have the words to describe what they're feeling because they have no reference, right? They have no reference or understanding of how this is different from normal. Teenagers are better at it, and older children, but overall, I'd say we need to look at the behaviors and ask ourselves, what is the behavior telling us? Kids are coping in different ways, anywhere, just like adults. So anywhere from, denial to fear, to sadness, and to acceptance. And when we get to acceptance, we can cope a bit better, but a lot of kids are not there, right? The grief can come in stages, just like the loss of a loved one. If you think of it that way, it kind of comes and goes, and you're grieving different things at different times. So I will talk a little bit about some of the regressions we're seeing in kids in terms of their behaviors and some of their habits. And we'll also, I'll talk a little bit about anxiety and worries and fear, and what to do for that specifically. And let's not forget that kids are extremely in tune with us. And so they are picking up on our own stress. And that's not to say that, that's a bad thing. There's a way that we can talk to them about it. But certainly they're feeling it. And for some kids who are very sensitive, they might feel responsible for it because they're around all the time and they know that that's an added burden on us. So we'll talk a bit about that also. All right. Any questions so far? Feel free if you have anything, comments or questions, you can also put it in the chat and Chris will relay those to me. Because I don't see the chat function, but if you have any questions or comments. No, we're good. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to talk a little bit is tips for managing parenting and supporting your kids at home with school, working from home. So first, I guess the question is, why is this particularly hard, right? I mean, we're home, we have flexibility, we have, I think for everyone in this group, you have income coming in. So there's a lot of people that feel almost like shame for feeling overwhelmed, which is really unhelpful to yourself, right? Because our own realities are our own realities and we can't compare ourselves to other people. This is a big change for us. And why is it hard? Well, the reason is there really is a reason that we're either a working parent, a stay-at-home parent, or a part-time working parent, and that we're not also teachers, right? You're kind of usually not juggling all these things full-time, right? So working, parenting, and teaching are really three distinct jobs that really can't be done at the same time. So I think it's really important to remind yourself regularly that this is not hard because you're doing it wrong, right? This is really hard because it's just too much. We're trying to do too much and we're not superheroes, right? We don't have special powers where we can get all of this done. So it's really important. I'm going to talk about self-compassion, but one of the things I think is most important right now is to be kind to yourself and, be gentle with yourself. And at the end of the day, when you're unsure what's most important, I think what I'm going to argue is that connection is really the most important. So making kids feel safe, if schoolwork, and again, school's coming to an end, but if schoolwork is creating stress and a lot of fights and arguments, maybe have them do something else that they'd rather learn about, have them choose to do whatever they want that is perhaps educational in a different way. We're not homeschoolers, right? In the same way that we're not working from home, we're trying to get work done at home while we're home in a crisis. We're also not homeschoolers. If you look at people who actually commit to homeschooling, they research for years, right? How the best approaches and practices, they connect with other families, they organize field trips, like it's a whole thing, right? So we're not homeschoolers. We're trying to support our kids at home in a crisis with their schooling. It's very, very different, right? And again, there's a huge range and variability across the city in terms of how much support their kids are getting from their school. And that can be a source of frustration sometimes because you might want more, you might want less, you might feel a lot of pressure to get it done, and that sort of thing. So we're really doing the most we can. So if you're feeling really stressed about what the kids are doing and how much how productive they're being with regards to their academics, I really would suggest lowering your expectations a little bit and get some support for yourself, but also kind of let some things go because their academics, they're going to catch up on that. That's not what they're going to remember, what they learned and how much work they did, right? They're going to remember how they felt during this pandemic, and they're going to remember the things that you said to them during this pandemic and whether you were able to keep calm, which is not always easy, those sorts of things. So, when you feel like overwhelmed, I always recommend to just kind of lower expectations and take a moment to connect with your child or children over and above whatever it is you're trying to get them to do. And remember that you are entitled to whatever it is you're feeling, right? So the amount of shame and guilt that I see in parents, especially parents who are used to being high achievers, very successful in their careers, successful at home, they've always felt on top of everything. Comparing yourself to the neighbor down the street who lost their job and whose parents are in a retirement home that's in lockdown because of COVID, that's not helpful to compare ourselves to others and think how much better we have it. So why am I complaining? You're allowed to feel whatever you feel, right? And it's really important to give yourself that permission because our reality is all our own reality and we're all comparing it to our regular normal, right? Not someone else's normal. So the top tips I'm going to talk about, really I'm going to talk about three things just to keep it simple. So I'm going to talk about the importance of routine and structure. I'm going to talk about self-care. And I'm going to talk about emotionally supporting the kids. Okay, so those are kind of the three main things I'm going to talk about. So first, what do kids need? Like in terms of resiliency, because that's all of our hope is that they're going to come out of this feeling more resilient, right? So what do we know about what kids need for resiliency? Well, first of all, they need basic needs met, right? So health, healthy food, housing, face-to-face contact, some physical activity and fresh air, good sleep habits. Those are basic needs that are always really, really important for increasing resiliency. But they also have higher needs that encourage and promote resiliency. So things like a feeling of belonging, feeling loved, having a sense of purpose and meaning. And for us, one of our major sense of purposes is to be parents. In addition to our job, it's to be parents and to feel like we're doing okay at it, which again, right now, sometimes I think some of us question, which impacts our mood, right? But it's also really important to recognize that kids need a healthy amount of stress to grow. And sometimes we forget that because we think we should shield kids from stress and we should try to protect them from the realities of what's out there. And the reality is that's actually wrong, that kids do need to experience stress in order to grow. And a few years ago, I heard this analogy of children being like lobsters. And it's one of my favorite analogies because if you know anything about lobsters, they're born and then as their body grows on the inside, their shell never actually grows. So what happens is their body inside kind of grows until it becomes so tight and uncomfortable, they shed their shell and then they grow a new one, right? And so in many ways, I think of facing adversity similarly. So as kids kind of face adversity and face stress, as they grow, they have to feel that discomfort and that, discomfort, and then shed their shell in order to further grow, right? So I think that that's kind of a nice analogy. I love it because it reminds me sometimes when I feel so bad for my kids for experiencing certain stress. I'm like, okay, no, they actually need to get through this and cope with it on their own in some ways with support in order to grow and to flourish. And then for teenagers, I don't know if we have parents of teenagers out here, but obviously for teenagers, there's an additional importance of sense of autonomy. That is extremely, extremely important, which is very hard right now because we're scared to let our kids be too independent and by fear that they're going to make bad choices, right? And I don't know if you've seen, I look outside any day around 9, 10 at night and teenagers are flocking in groups all over the place, right? So they're not social distancing, they're not necessarily taking the proper precautions, but that need for connection with peer group is actually super important. So I'll talk a little bit about what we can do to mitigate that need in this time. All right, so obviously, the first thing I'm actually going to talk about is self-care, because to me, that's kind of the top of the pyramid, or the foundation of a house, however you want to look at it. If you don't have that, the rest crumbles. The whole analogy of putting on your own oxygen mask before putting on your child's on a plane very much applies to our life all the time. And especially, I think right now, if we're not taking good care of ourselves, it's going to be very hard for us to be there in the way that our kids are going to need us, right? So making sure that our own needs are met, right? That we're taking good care of ourselves as much as possible and making time for our own support, our own social connections, exercise, limiting our own news intake, for example, things like that, building a good network, and of course, self-compassion. So if you don't know what self-compassion is, it's basically being your own best friend. Right? We're really good at validating other people that we care about emotions. So someone comes up to us and says, oh my God, my kids were on the TV for 10 hours today. All they ate was junk food. I'm failing as a parent. I feel like crap. We're never going to say to them, yeah, you know what? Yeah, you should feel like crap. You're a terrible parent, right? We would never say that. We'd say, you know what, give yourself a break. You're doing the best you can. I'm sure that, there were moments of connection during the day. I'm sure your kids feel loved, and really that's what matters. But we don't do that to ourselves, right? So self-compassion is basically telling yourself what you would tell your friend. So in moments of stress and moments where you're feeling overwhelmed, is like being able to turn to yourself and say, you know what, I did the best I could today. I could do better, sure, but I'm proud that I got through today and my kids are fed, etc. Right? So the important thing that their needs were met. So self-compassion is, again, being your own friend and being able to say things to yourself that you would say to someone else. And I would say lowering our expectations. I've said that again, we can't physically be 100% at everything. We can't be 100% parent and wife or husband or partner and teacher and, employee and leader of our team, et cetera. And and try not to focus on things you can't control, right? So what other people are doing, what other people think you are doing, or what you think people think about you, things that you can't get at the store, or things you can't do anymore right now, things like that, that really kind of affect our mood. Try to kind of change the channel and focus on things that are under your control or in your control, because that will have a kind of an impact on mood. All right, any questions or comments? Avez-vous des questions?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here, Carolyn. This is fantastic. We have a couple questions from folks that have come through on the chat function. One of them is they're both a little bit related to the impact on kids of all ages of not being able to socialize. So, you know, if you're very young, these are key development years. You need to, you know, have that opportunity to socialize at daycare or whatever. Same thing if you're a teenager. And actually, I have a related question as well, which is, you know, I'm a little bit concerned about my daughters being afraid of people, and don't want them to sort of develop this fear of being near somebody or you know, next to somebody, that kind of thing. So there you go.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Those are great questions. And certainly you're right. The need for connection is, we're all bonding creatures, right? From birth, we're bonding creatures. So those needs are always there. I focused on teenagers more for the need for, that's how they develop their identity, right? It's through social connections. So it's a little bit different what the need brings, like why that social need is important. But absolutely. I mean, I think young kids, they have many years ahead of them to kind of make up that time. There might be a period of adjustment at the beginning because they've been taught to stay 6 feet away from everybody, which you're right, it can instill fear. And so it's all about conversation of how we have those discussions. And I will come back to that actually, because fear is something that often can be learned, especially phobias, right? So being really scared of this virus and being scared of getting close to people, there are things we can do to mitigate that as parents. So I'll come back to that. But in terms of the need for social connection, yes, you're right. And, you know, unfortunately, this is another thing added on our plate as parents, is to really help facilitate and make that happen. I really feel like I'm, you know, 90% a social coordinator these days. So I'm making sure that my kids are connected. It's very difficult because you're dealing with other families that have different levels of comfort of what that looks like. And it does require being quite creative, I think, on how you're going to do it, right? So whether it's you set up, for example, even with young kids to connect with their peers virtually, it's still, but with video, okay? That's really important, is that there's a big difference, and the research shows us that there's a big difference between audio, so just phone calls, for example, versus video. And so if you know, making sure your kids are connecting with their peers with video so that they can play virtually with each other, they can show each other toys, they can see each other's emotions on their face, those sorts of things are really, really important. So that's one thing we can do even with very young kids. I'm doing a lot of virtual sessions with clients, and even with young kids, I'm playing games using a whiteboard against the screen, like Hangman, right? We can play Hangman through the screen. We can play Pictionary, right? So the idea, you think of an object or an animal, draw it, can you guess what this is, kind of thing. So there are various things like that. There's lots of actually online games, like board games. For older kids, you can play board games virtually with video. So there's other ways to be creative there for families that are really cautious. For kids who are a little bit older, who understand the importance of distancing, I think that having some social, actual face-to-face time in real life is really, really helpful. So whether that means, you know, going for a picnic at the park, or going for a bike ride, going for a walk, but staying a little bit further apart, or if you're not comfortable letting them go, having them in your backyard, you know, those are all things that are permitted now. So I think that it's just a question of making it happen and organizing it. But I think you're right that we can't lose sight of that's really, really important.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I was going to talk about routine and structure. So this is very important, perhaps, you know, second to self-care. I really put these in order of importance. I think having a routine and a structure is incredibly important. I can't underestimate this enough. And going into summer, this is going to be just as important as it is now. So kids thrive on predictability and routine and structure. That doesn't mean that this should be stressful. Okay, so I'm going to be very clear about that. But kids thrive on predictability. So when kids are in school, it's very predictable, right? You often see kids that have all these behavioral issues at home, but are fine at school. And then you look at the environments, and maybe at home it's a lot less structured, but at school they do great because everything is predictable. Transitions are predictable. When I eat, when I go outside, when whatever, right? It's very predictable. And you know your kid best, so you're going to know how much structure is needed. Everybody's different. So I'm going to give you some options of what this can look like, and you have to kind of adapt it for your own family because everybody is very, very different. But going through a routine is so, so important, especially because, you know, at first, at the beginning of the pandemic, I think for a lot of families, it felt like a bit of a vacation. Like, yay, this is fun. We can, like, you know, watch movies all day. We can, like, eat at random times. We can sleep at, like, what, you know, we kind of were a bit more loose about it. And then a lot of families, we saw a huge peak in our referrals at the clinic, actually, about a month after the pandemic started. And it was amazing to me how many families I sat down with and helped them get a routine and a structure in, and then they were okay again. They were back on track. So again, I can't kind of underestimate this a lot. So what I want to make sure to emphasize, though, is this, you know, having a routine is meant to be a tool, not something that is another thing to stress you out, okay? It's really meant to be a tool. So it can go from something that's very specific, and I'm going to share with you mine, but this is just one example, okay? And ours is specific because that's what my kids need. So I'll show it to you. If you can see this, I just pulled it off the wall. This is taped up in 3 different parts of the house. Can you see that? Anyway, I'll read it to you. But basically, okay, great. It's itemized by time. And then we've got things like, okay, so get up and shower and get dressed or whatever, and then have breakfast and clean up and stuff. And then we had scheduled kind of 2 academic blocks in the day where they do their schoolwork. And then, you know, with more or less independence, but I'm fortunate enough that my husband and I are a bit flexible, so we're able to switch off halfway through the day. So we're able to get half a day of work in kind of almost, not quite, but almost uninterrupted. Then we have some free time, and I wrote here, screen time is unavailable, so they have to be creative. Lunch time, and then I have family contribution. That's what we call chores, because chores seems to make them react, but if you say family contribution, it seems less weird. Exercise, fresh air. Okay, then they have free time with screen time before dinner, and then we do go for a walk and have family time at night, bedtime, lights out kind of thing. So this is one example. Again, it's not meant to say, hey, use this. It's just, here's what mine looks like as an example of a schedule that is quite structured. And the way that we came up with this is we sat down all together. We thought about, I said, here are the things that have to be in your day, right? So you have to have exercise. You have to eat 3 meals. You have to have some social time. You have to have academic time, and you have to have some creative time. Oh, and family time. And then we kind of came up with this together. So my kids are old enough that they had ideas and of how they wanted to do it, and like whether they wanted to go outside before lunch or did they want to go outside after lunch. So I give them some sense of agency and control. And then we made it and we tried it out for 3 or 4 days. And then we went back to it because it turned out some things weren't really working. So we went back to it. So, okay, what do we need to change? And again, your kids are going to be much more motivated and engaged if they have a say, a little bit of a say. And we can do forced choices, right? So you have to do academic time. When do you want to do it, right? And then you can negotiate how that kind of happens. So that's an example of a very specific one. You can also have ones that are much more unstructured. So that's like, okay, morning, afternoon, evening. That's simple. And in the morning, so between, you know, X time and X time, you have to do these things and you decide when you want to do them. You know, that could be another example of a less structured. For younger kids who can't read, it can be visual. So you can make a little organization, a little structure with images, right? So you've got a picture of a child coloring and a picture of a child watching TV and a picture of a child eating or whatever, and you put it in order. And, you know, even if you had it like plastified or something, they could check it off. So young kids, that's kind of fun for them. They can go over and they can check off, okay, I did that. Okay, now what's next? And then they can see what they have to do. And it gives them, again, a little bit more independence so you can breathe. You're not on them all the time. And if the reward is something that's very motivating, which for a lot of kids, it's screen time, it could be kind of an if-then statement, right? So if you do these things, then you can have screen time at the end of the day. So that's how I work it in my house. My kids are motivated by screen time. Okay, well, you've got to do all these things first. And then when it's done, at 4:30, you can have access to screen time. So that's how it works in my house. Everybody's different again, but I find that very helpful. And if they didn't do the things they need to do, suddenly it eats into their screen time. So sometimes they only have to learn once that they lost screen time because they didn't finish whatever. You know, But that being said, it's also important to be flexible, right? If there's a day when your children are not doing as well emotionally, it's okay to scrap the some of what's on there, right? And just say, you know what, today's a hard day. Why don't we spend more time doing X, or right, and being a bit more flexible. I know the day that they announced that schools weren't going back, my kids were devastated. I have a kid graduating from grade 6, so there's tons of grief about this loss of ritual and celebration, really, right? It was a really hard day. So I said, you know what, let's just scrap everything we had planned for today. What do you want to do, right? And so he wanted to lie in the hammock and read as a family, which was lovely. So, you know, whatever kids need, we have to also be flexible in that way, but making sure we have all that in. And when you're doing it, you have to also keep into consideration your own needs as a parent. What do I need to do in a day, right? When can I structure in some uninterrupted work time, right? So you can figure out a way to structure the day to find chunks of time, because it's not realistic to be interrupted every 3 minutes, right? So, okay, you got to go do this independently. I'm going to come back and check in. If they can tell the time, right? You can tell them when you're going to come back and check in on them, and then you can go and kind of lock yourself in your office. Obviously, this doesn't work for toddlers. They don't understand. But, you know, really, as of even 4 or 5 years of age, the idea of like a green light, red light on your office door or wherever you've secluded yourself. So red light means you can't come in right now, but green light means you can, assuming you've set them up with something that's safe, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of caveats there, and we're all different on what that looks like. But, you know, putting an office sign on the door is a good tip. Sharing the day if you're more than one parent is a good tip, that sort of thing. And now moving into summer, what is this going to look like? I think continuing to have some structure like this is going to be really important. And even though they won't have schoolwork per se, intellectual stimulation is important. So every family is different. In my family, I've asked them to identify a few things that they want to learn, right? So what are you interested in? Whatever you want, I don't care, right? What is it? I want to learn to play guitar. I want to learn to juggle. I want to learn a bit more about World War II. I want whatever it is. And then kind of help them figure out a little bit of how they're going to find that information. How are they going to learn about it? And then that becomes their academic block, right? Or whatever. So they're still learning stuff, excuse me, and making time to read and connect with their friends and be outside in the summer are really important. So the schedule is going to look quite different in the summer, but I think, again, it's important. So having a sense of agency, negotiating, and coming up with this together a little bit is great. Giving some choice. So this is a creative time. Here's some examples of things you can do, and make sure that the supplies are available so they can do it a little bit more independently. And then kids who are really dependent on you and not very good at engaging independently, now is a great time to start instilling those skills, because it's a really important skill, by starting with small chunks, right? So children who are really dependent, I would suggest starting with, 5-minute, 10-minute intervals and then building it up. They will learn, right? And if you praise them and they have rewards on the other end, so kids are very incentive driven, just like we are as adults, right? We're driven by promotions, we're driven by vacation time, et cetera, which we can get if we do X, Y, Z. Kids are no different. So if they know that they're working towards an incentive or a goal of some kind, breaking it up can be really helpful. Any questions? Oh, I see hands.
Hi, Carolyn. Yeah, we've got 3 more questions from the chat group. Maybe I'll just paraphrase them, but again, the question that you raised or you addressed already about once school ends, there'll be less structure. So how do you sort of fill the gaps there? But also any tips on how to keep kids connected with their peers? Should parents look to manage an online group with other parents? Any suggestions for how to keep kids connected? That's the first question. Okay. You want to go ahead and take that one?
Yeah, sure. So, okay, so I think I answered the first part of that question, which is how to structure the day. So I think, again, making sure you have all of those basic needs in the day and keeping a routine. What time do they wake up? Like getting up and getting dressed, right? So still keeping that kind of routine is really important for mental health for our kids. Making sure they have some social time, yes. So how do we make sure that happens? I mean, it really depends on the age of your child. But I think, up until a teenage year, it's going to be you that organizes it and makes it happen. But you can make it simple. Like one of the things I did, which I found really helpful, actually, was I scheduled a Zoom call every Friday at 3 for my 11-year-old. So every Friday at 3, all of these friends, at first they thought it was weird because they thought like it's run by a parent, this is weird, but now they realize they're on their own. So they're all in their own little space and they have privacy, and they connect every Friday online at 3. And more recently, they were saying how hard it is to think of things to say. So here's another thing you have to think about is that the kids don't have a lot of news, right? Because what have you been doing? Well, more of the same. You know, I'm home and I'm doing more of the same. So they don't have a lot of things to talk about and connect. And kids really connect on shared experience. That's what they usually talk about and bond over is shared experience. And they're not having, aside from being home in a pandemic, they're not having a lot of shared experience. So what I suggested to my son was like, well, maybe you guys should, you know, organize some kind of game. And he really liked that idea. So that's what he's doing today is for the first time, instead of just chatting, they're actually going to try to play a game online through video. So sometimes you have to be creative. I've also organized, you know, bike rides. So I contact parents that I know would be open and trust their kids to be safe, and going for little bike rides and giving them a little bit of independence and keeping the groups small because that gives them more control as well, or walking to Dairy Queen and getting an ice cream or going for a walk in the woods together or whatever it is. But it does kind of require us being a bit creative and thinking about what that's going to look like. We've had play dates in the backyard where the kids are on opposite ends of the table and they're both on their devices in Minecraft, right? So they're in the same world, they're playing a game together, they have to be in the same Wi-Fi to do that. So, you know, so it does require some creativity, but certainly, and for younger kids, I mean, the parents have to be very highly involved in that because they don't understand the distancing part, you know. So yeah, I think that, and we don't want to stress them out too much about that either. You know, if they're washing their hands and you're outside, again, you know, public health will say the risk is low. So just be careful about how close they get. I see kids all the time, you know, jumping in trampolines together and things like that. So it all depends on your comfort level too. But there's lots that you can do there.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. The next question is, how do you reconcile routine and schedule for a younger child, like a 7-year-old who needs a schedule and likes a schedule, and a teenager who's super organized but may not want to be scheduled as much over the summer? Fantastic question.
So I always say kids don't need to be, you know what, we've been raised to think that we have to treat our kids the same. And that's total BS. Like that's not true because our kids are not the same. They're different kids. They have different needs, different personalities. Some need, yeah. So I would say put them on different routines, put them on different schedules. I think that the teenager still needs to make sure certain things happen, but they have a lot more agency in how that happens. And a lot of what we're doing with teenagers and suggesting for teenagers too is sort of harm reduction, right? So we know they're going to be doing certain things and we need to make sure that they're just being safe about it. So for example, I have a friend whose teenager's been sneaking out at night because, you know, he just recently started having sex and then we went in a pandemic, you know, 16-year-old boy. So, you know, you're not going to prevent him from going out. So he was sneaking out at night, right, and meeting up with his girlfriend. So we talked about, well, what could you do? And so they came up with this plan where, you know, okay, listen, I know you're going to do this anyway. When you come home, I need you to kind of leave all your clothes because we have immunocompromised people in the house. You need to, like, you know, change in the garage, disinfect yourself in your hands, go in the shower right away, you know, whatever. So more like harm reduction stuff is going to be kind of important that way. But sorry, back to the schedule. So with teenagers, I think, yeah, is telling them what the non-negotiables are, because they still have non-negotiables. You need to make sure that you eat. You need to make sure that you have fresh air and exercise, that you're doing some kind of social, some kind of intellectual stimulation, sort of all those basic needs. But you can decide what that looks like. Give me a plan. Show me what that could look like. How is that going to work for you? And that they can be on separate plans, and that's just fine.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. And then the last question here, and it looks like a couple of people are interested in it. Is how do we talk to our kids about what the fall is going to look like? School may not be the same, sports, other activities may be canceled. You want to prepare them, but you don't want to worry them too much. How do you do that?
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, I'm dealing with that a lot around here these days. So the answer is we don't know, right? So we can't make any promises, and we don't want to kind of go to the worst case scenario either. So I think part of that is to say, you know, it's unlikely to look like normal. and, but we're hoping everything will be, you'll be able to go back to school, but it won't be quite the same. And you can start talking about what that's going to look like. But I would also suggest not going into too much detail really until August. Like, let's focus on the summer. Let's make the most of our summer. What are some fun things you want to do this summer? What can we do in this reality that's going to make the summer something to look forward to instead of dreading the fall? You know what I mean? So with kids, I suggest, because to them, the fall is still far away. That's hard for us to remember too sometimes as adults, I think. Like, if you go back to being a child and you remember your summers, like 2 months of summer felt like a really long time. Do you guys remember that? Whereas now it's like, what? It's already mid-June. Like, what is going on? Time is just flying by as we get older. So remembering that to the kids, the fall is a far time away. So if we give them too much negative or too many things to worry about what's coming, it's going to have a real sense of dread that's going to overshadow the summer, right? So I would really pay attention more to now, and let's make the most of now. And we'll talk about that when we know more in August.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Could I also ask 2 questions?
Sure.
Okay. I wondered if you had pointers for reducing screen time and also for addressing sibling rivalry.
Right. Those are probably 2 of the big stressors, eh? Yeah. So, okay. So that was a big question. So screen time, again, before the pandemic, the Canadian Pediatric Society and a lot of developmental psychologists were always saying, try not to have more than 2 hours of screen time in a day max, kind of thing. And now it's like, we're all saying, okay, did you have less than 14 hours today? Okay, good job, right? So reducing screen time, I'd say you have to also pick your battles. I mean, I think one of the things you can do is flip it as a reward instead of something that's just given if you're worried about it. And also remind yourself that this isn't forever, right? Screen time right now is something we're doing because it's helping us get stuff done. And I think because it's one of the things that's going to engage them without needing our help. We can always go back to those good habits and better habits after the pandemic is over. But if you're really worried about what it is they're doing with their screen time, then it's about sitting down and having a conversation like you would even if we weren't in a pandemic, which is that not all screen time is created equal, right? So what are we doing on screen time? So if they're paying like 12 hours of Fortnite in a day, that is more worrisome to me than if they're doing, half an hour of YouTube, half an hour of Netflix, a couple hours of Minecraft, and then an hour of Fortnite in a day, and they're diversifying a little bit. Some games that are a lot more creative versus some games that are less creative, right? So making sure you're helping them make good choices on how they're going to structure their screen time, and then using it again as an incentive or a reward once they've done other things that they need to do in their day. And the summertime is a good time to reset that, right? If you're in bad habits now that you're not happy with as a parent, then now is a good time to sit down and say, okay, what's the summer going to look like? What do you guys want to do in a day? How are we going to structure it? Okay, does that answer that part? Yeah, okay. And then the second part is sibling rivalry. So definitely right now we're seeing lots of that. We're seeing a lot of spousal rivalry too, right? Because, well, we're getting sick of each other. Even if we love each other, we're getting sick of each other. So first, I think it's to validate that this is hard and you're spending a lot of time with your sibling. And I would validate that a lot, right? So oftentimes we try to correct it, right? So kids will say, oh, I hate my brother, or I hate my sister, they're so annoying. And we always want to be like, no, like you guys get along all the time. What are you talking about, right? Instead of saying, yeah, you know what, it's really hard to have a sibling right now sometimes, and to spend this much time with your sibling when they're your only real playmate on a regular basis. This is hard. So teaching them to recognize when they need a break from each other and to be able to voice that in a polite way, right? Like, I need a break, and then being able to leave and go into their own space. And protect that space so that they have a place to go, I would say is really, really important. Making sure that they find their own niche and they're able to and allowed to separate from their sibling when they need a break. It's really important. So that's a big question. I hope I've kind of answered with a few tips. Are there any other questions for now? No? Okay. I'm getting some feedback. I don't know if someone's mic is still open. If you don't mind muting it, where that's coming from. It's like traffic. I hear like traffic.
I don't hear it on mine.
No? Okay, that's weird. Okay. Okay, so so the last parenting tip I was going to talk about, which is a great lead into what we were just talking about, is around how to support your kids emotionally. I used to do workshops, or I've done many workshops for school boards on this exact topic, and it's really like in and of itself like a 2-hour kind of workshop that then I often come back to the school a month later and we kind of go back to it to practice, because it's really not a natural thing for most people to do. So let me validate that first. If you're interested in this topic, there's a great book by John Gottman called Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child. Fantastic read if you're looking for, and we're all overwhelmed, so I'm not going to say you go read it now, but if you want to, it's a really good book. So what I want to talk about is how to validate kids' emotions. So the example that I just gave, right, with regards to sibling rivalry. As parents, we often try to fix things. Always. We want to fix it. We want to make it go away. We want our kids to be comfortable. Or these days, we don't have a lot of patience. We want it to just stop, right? We don't have the time and the energy to dedicate to it. So really spending time making sure that we slow down and we listen and we validate our kids requires sometimes to be not fake. I don't want you to be fake, but it does require like embellishing a little bit, maybe what we would naturally do. So all kids, you know, are going to have some issues with their thoughts or their feelings or their behaviors at different times. And again, their behaviors usually are telling us that something's not right, right? That they're communicating something to us through their behaviors. So the first thing we really need to do is just try to slow down the conversation and really validate the feeling, right? So we often go right into problem solving and trying to fix it instead of slowing down and validating. So what does this mean? So empathy comes, kids need a lot of empathy, especially right now. And I think it really comes from a place of like, instead of saying, well, at least you're home, at least we have a salary coming in, at least you're not like so-and-so, you know, whose parents aren't home at all or whatever. Those are not empathic statements, right? Because kids don't care about what other people, like they really just want to feel heard. And again, this is probably one of the most important things at this time to do, because at the end of the day, kids are going to remember during the pandemic how they felt and how you responded to those feelings. They're not going to remember a lot of the details of what they did in their day or anything like that. They're really going to remember how they felt. That's how memory for kids works, especially in a trauma. So what this means is, and I guess the key, and I've written up a little handout with some key things I'm saying today, and then some websites and resources if you want them that Chris will send to you. But one of the key things, like if one thing sticks with you from everything I've said today, it's this, which is connection before direction. So important. That is probably, no matter the age of your child, it's probably the most important parenting technique. And yet we never talk about it openly. Like, what does that mean? Like, stop, slow down, and connect with your child before you try to correct it. So your child hits you because they're angry about something. You want to stop and say, wow, you're really angry, right? I see you're really angry. This makes you angry when you don't get what you want right away. You get angry. And it's not that you're saying it's okay to hit, because you're going to get to that. But the first thing you need to do, because what happens when you validate and you label the emotion for the child, that emotion goes down immediately. Instead of getting worse, it actually goes down. And we often are afraid to do it because we think it's going to get worse, but it has the opposite effect. It actually will bring the emotion down and calm the child. So validating the child, you know, oh God, I feel like I'm doing this like crazy right now with my almost 12-year-old, because the amount of grief around the loss of this transition to grade 7. And I know in my heart that this, in the grand scheme of life, a grade 7 graduation ceremony, grade 6 graduation ceremony is really not, I'm going to say this not very loud, but it's not a very big deal, right? Like it's not prom. It's not, I know that, but not like, this is all he knows. So for him, this is ginormous. So the amount of times I'm saying things like, I'm so sorry that this is happening now. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for you that you're losing this time. It is so disappointing. It's sad. You don't get to say goodbye to your teachers. You don't get to say goodbye to your classmates. I really understand how much this sucks for you. And just slowing it down and validating and allowing the emotion to come out, because it has to come out. And crying is actually super healthy way to get your emotions out. because kids, if they misbehave or they act out and they turn off, for many kids, it's because they have pent up emotion they're holding in, and like a volcano, it kind of builds up and then it erupts, right? So you want to get that emotion out. You want them to be able to label it, because you're also teaching them it's safe to talk about it. It's okay to talk about it. And the next time they feel that way, they might come straight to you and say, I'm so disappointed that this got canceled, instead of acting out or yelling at you or, being more irritable, but they're actually able to say the words. Yes, Chris, you have a question.
Yeah, I just want to jump into the question in case the person that asked it needs to leave at noon. I think most of us will stay on, so here's the question. How do we explain to our children why other parents are more or less lax than we are with social distancing measures? My kids tend to get frustrated with me for not allowing them to do things their friends are doing.
Yeah, isn't that hard, eh? And you know what? This isn't dissimilar to any other parenting technique, right? So you don't let your kids play Fortnite, let's say. That's a rule in your house, excuse me, but other houses allow their kids to play lots of Fortnite. It's the same parenting technique, which is, you know what, like, I, as a parent, we're going to make our own decisions for what's best for our family. And those can be different than what other people decide is best for their family, right? We can't understand why, we don't know. And it's not for us to judge that, right? Everybody has a right to make their own decisions for what's right for their family. And for us, this is what we've chosen and this is what's important to us. And for them, it could be different. So you're teaching them that different families have different rules for anything, including social distancing measures. And if you have someone in your family, if one of the reasons that you're more strict is because someone is more prone to the virus, this is a great opportunity to educate that, right? In our family, we like to visit grandma, and grandma has a lung disorder that causes her to be more prone to COVID. So we have to be extra careful, right, et cetera. So that kind of thing, you can add more explanation if you need to. But it's okay to just come down to family values. In our family, we value this. And, the whole, like, if George jumped off the bridge, would you too, right? That's what our parents used to say in our generation. Well, now we don't really encourage those kinds of things, but instead we want to say they have different, different priorities, different values, and that's okay. Every family has a right to make their own choice there. For our family, we've chosen this.
Thank you so much. I'm going to jump in with a quick question myself. It relates a bit to self-care, and I hadn't thought about until you discussed it here how important it is as a parent to be thinking about ways to look after yourself too. And I sort of categorize my friends, for example, on Facebook into two groups. One who are, posting positive things about family activities and trying to do this and that and whatnot. And then another group where it's like, a picture of somebody drinking a whole bottle of wine out of a single glass, or taking pictures of our houses that are in absolute disarray, sort of gallows humor stuff. Hey, my kid just watched 20 hours straight of something. And I vacillate between the two. I realize I don't want to be negative all the time, but at the same time, there is a little bit of frustration relief when we all recognize how difficult and frankly how badly we're doing in many cases. So I guess the question is kind of how do you balance that, and are they both healthy?
Oh, I love that question so much. Are they both healthy? Well, it depends how you digest that information, right? There are lots of people, social media can be horrible for that, is that a lot of people can post the best parts of their life, right? But it's snippets, and we have to educate our kids about this too, guys, right? As they get older, what we're seeing is not the reality of everything that they're living behind closed doors, right? You're getting snippets of the best part of their life, and we're all human at the end of the day. So I would say when you see those images, or anybody sees images like that, or, thinks and then has shame and guilt about their own choices as a parent and what they're not doing, and why can't I be more like that, and you're comparing, that's a great thing to be reflecting on, and maybe limiting your social media intake, because that is really not healthy for you. That's for sure. The memes and the jokes are great because, you know what, like, vulnerability from others brings out vulnerability in us. And that connects with us, allows us to connect with others in a deeper emotional level. And actually, the research is showing that the effects of isolation right now for people, it's not the physical isolation that's a problem for mental health, it's the emotional isolation, the feeling lonely because of the lack of emotional connection with others, like that deep emotional connection with others. So those kinds of things, when people are vulnerable with us and telling us this is hard, like that feels good, because you know what, like it allows you to then be vulnerable and share something too. And then you've just bonded with this person and you feel validated. And at the end of the day, that's healthy, right? That's important to feel like, yeah, this is hard. Okay, it's hard for all of us in different ways, but we have this common experience, instead of if you're constantly feeling shame and guilt, right? So being really aware of how different people make you feel, and then different images or intake of social media makes you feel, is part of that self-care, right? It's being aware and knowing, being very mindful of how this is making me feel, and then making a choice for yourself that's going to make you feel good. That's what I would say.
That's super. Thank you. And just folks, if you want to hit the raise your hand button, if you want to ask questions directly yourself, please don't hesitate.
All right.
Otherwise,
so I'm going to just
keep going along.
Okay. Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Okay. So I was just talking about emotional support. So I'm just going to elaborate that on a bit further, because I talked about kind of slowing it down. But I want to make clear that it doesn't mean that you still don't correct, right? So again, connection before direction. So connecting, slowing it down. So with the sibling rivalry, I'll use that as an example again, because it's so common. You've got two kids in the bath and one smacks one on the head. Our response and they say, I hate my brother, I wish he was never born. The parent's response is usually, no, you don't. You play with your brother a lot. You love being, which what you're doing is minimizing their emotion in that moment, right? So again, when we connect before direct, it means slowing down and saying, yeah, you know what? It's hard having a sibling sometimes, and we don't always get along. And I remember when I was growing up, if you share a part of your own life too, that's a great opportunity to model, right? That you also experienced that. And you can say, when I was a kid, my brother and I also used to fight a lot, but now we're close. But yeah, it's kind of normal to fight a lot, especially when you're spending this much time together. So you're validating that it's okay to feel this way. You're helping them find the words for what it is they're feeling. And then later, once everything is calmed down, you can have that conversation. Again, it could be part of the same conversation just a few minutes later. You can say, next time you're angry, what could you say instead? Because that's kind of hurtful, right? Or when you're angry and you want to hit me, it's not okay to hit me. What can we do instead when you're angry with that feeling? So you're kind of trying to correct it and give them direction on what to do differently. But you don't do that until after. And this is true for any age, from very young kids all the way through the teen years, right? Is like, I can see you're frustrated, like I'm here, right? And for teenagers, it might not be, they don't want advice. They really don't want your advice, right? They want you to hear them. So you just want to listen, and you just want to say, wow, that sounds really hard, right? I remember finding that hard too when I was a teenager, right? You don't want to overshare too much about your teenage years, because also they don't think you're ancient to them, so you won't remember. It's nothing like what I'm experiencing, etc. But validating, and then later you can say, what can I give you some advice? You can, with teenagers, you want to ask for permission, right? Can I give you some advice about that? Like, do you want my advice? I've got some ideas, but you have to wait till what we call in the green zone, right? If you're in the red zone, which is like highly distressed, that is not the time to be problem solving or to be giving advice, because it's going to go right over their head. They're not going to hear you, and they might get really annoyed with you. But if they're in the green zone and they're calm, that's the time to have that conversation. I notice every time we kind of talk about X, Y, Z, you get really upset. Like, can you help me understand that? What can we do about it? What can I do to help you, etc. when they're in the green zone. So that's kind of emotional, we call it emotion coaching techniques. It's kind of how to support our kids emotionally. And in this time, don't forget, this is a big trauma, right? That they're living through. And we really want to, when we see their behavior and we see things that we question, it's checking in with them. It's validating that this is hard. You can share how it's hard for you. It's okay. It's okay to be vulnerable with your kids, right? If you parent in a way where you feel bad about it, like maybe you didn't make the best choice, because we all make mistakes, going back and saying, you know what, yesterday when you did this, I got really mad and I acted this way, or I might have said this, and I'm really sorry. What I actually meant was this. And if when you're doing that, you're showing a part of your humanity, right? You're being vulnerable, but you're also showing them that they can come back too and apologize to you when things go awry or they make mistakes, right? I think that's really, we underestimate that sometimes, but I think that's really important because you can correct it. And that's true with our spouse, our partner too, right? If we say things and we're like, oh boy, that's not what I meant, going back when you're in the green zone and saying, you know, yesterday or earlier today, I said this to you, I'm sorry, what I actually meant was this. Can we have a redo, right? Can we replay this and that kind of thing. And reminding them, you know, that no matter what, you love them and you're here for them and that kind of thing, really important that they hear that too, right? Okay, what time is it? 12 o'clock. So I had some stuff too about anxiety as well that I could talk about, and then maybe when to worry or when you think, you know, when's a good time to consult if you're worried that your kid is sort of beyond a normal response to the pandemic or a normal response to what's happening right now, when you should worry or maybe you should get professional help. So I don't know if we have time for both or if you want me to focus on more one than the other. I'm happy to take suggestions on what you guys would find most helpful. I'll give you a second maybe to put it in the chat.
Oh,
yep.
Yeah, we had Vaskin on for a second, but he's disappeared again.
No, I wasn't asking to. I just joined from a different device.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, maybe a little bit of both then, if you can, Carolyn.
Okay. So, so one of my area of expertise really, and what I did all my research in and what I do most of my clinical practice in is in anxiety and fear and worry. So I'll talk about that just kind of briefly for us and for our kids, right? For adults and for kids in terms of how we cope. So obviously having some worry is actually really healthy, right? Because it allows us to adapt. If we weren't worried about the virus, we wouldn't socially distance and we wouldn't, you know, put on a mask or gloves when we need to, when we're in a situation that may be more risky. So there is this adaptive function that's really, really important. But when it becomes a problem and when it becomes more anxiety than fear, like the difference between fear and worry and then anxiety is that anxiety is a hypothetical, right? Whereas fear and worry are kind of tangible, real, and like in front of you. So if you're walking down a path and a grizzly mama bear with her cubs comes face to face with you, like I would hope you felt some fear because it's going to cause you to get out of there safely, hopefully, right? And so that fight or flight response is going to kick in and you're going to get out of there. So fear is important for our survival, really, really important. But anxiety is something else, which is like you don't want to go for a hike in case you come face to face with a grizzly bear. So it prevents you from doing things you might want to do because of a fear of a hypothetical, right? It might happen. And then it can become something that can quickly become out of control, right? Because if you find you're not leaving the house at all because you're so afraid of the virus, for example, you might want to look at that, right? So what's the risk here really, and what is more risky than others, and how can you take precautions and things like that? So we know that, you know, there's a lot of research on stress and anxiety and how it impacts our immune system, which, you know, right now we need strong immune systems. So we want to keep our stress level or anxiety level down. And for people who are prone to anxiety, it is a genetic trait, right? It is something that runs in families. So if you yourself are highly anxious, it's possible your kids have more vulnerability to that too. And even very young kids can feel very anxious, but it looks really different in kids than it does in adults because they don't have the words, right? So very young kids can look like regression in potty training, for example, wetting the bed or having nightmares. It can also be behavioral problems. I get a lot of referrals for what they think is parenting for behavioral issues, and then I diagnose an anxiety disorder, you know, kind of thing. So we want to look at what are they, if they're genetically vulnerable for anxiety, but also things can be also learned, right? So if you have a phobia of dogs, imagine as an adult, we have a phobia of dogs. So every time we see a dog, we kind of run in the opposite direction, or if we're with our child, we pull them to the other side of the street so we don't cross the dog. It's very likely your child will develop a fear of dogs also, right? So phobias are something that can be learned through the behavior of watching your parent, even if they haven't had a bad experience, let's say, with a dog. So just as some basic information here. So Kids might be able to express, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. But again, you might see anger instead, you might see irritability instead, and then you might see behavioral problems or these sometimes physical complaints, like having a lot of headaches or stomach aches can be a sign in children that they're actually experiencing anxiety, because kids might hold it in and experience it more physically because they don't have the words. It really isn't until about 9 or 10 years of age that children are really even aware of the thoughts in their head. So they might say, I don't like that, I don't want to do that, and they look obstinate, but it's because they're flooded with anxiety. They don't have the words. They don't know what they're actually worried about, right? Really kind of an important thing. So here too, we want to validate, right? We want to connect before we direct when it comes to dealing with anxiety as well, right? We want to remind them, we want to limit news intake with kids who are more vulnerable to anxiety and worry. And they always hear things. So you might think you've got the news on in the background, they're not listening to it, they're occupied. If the news is on, they hear it, they're listening, right? And there's a lot of scary stuff on the news right now. For kids, it's very, very unsettling, as if the pandemic wasn't enough, right? All of these riots and things that are happening, injustices, there's a great way to have conversation about that stuff that I think is actually really important for our kids, but I don't know that watching the news is the way to do that. You have to be very careful about shielding kids from the news. And it's not making them ignorant either, like, or naive to what's happening. I think there's ways of having conversation, but being very careful that it's coming from you and not the media, because you need to mediate that and the messaging and bring it into your values as a family as you're doing it. Really, really important. So kids need, to know that they can handle this stuff, but also, they need to feel reassured and they need to feel safe. So reminding them all that you are doing. Sometimes too, you can take anxiety and turn it into proactive. Like if kids are really sensitive and worried about the state of the world, like you can involve them in things like sewing masks or making masks for other people that are vulnerable, like turn it into something that's proactive. That's one way to channel some of that worry too, but also kind of weighing the risk, right? Because as adults, most of us can balance our thoughts a little bit. Like we can be worried about something, but also say, okay, but I'm taking all these precautions. I'm healthy. I'm not in the high risk category. I know there's certain things I can do to like mitigate my risk and et cetera, right? So we can balance those thoughts, but children don't have that ability, and they need us to coach them through that. That's a pretty important thing as well. So limiting news and making sure also that whatever news you're listening to is credible. There's so much fake news out there, and the worst thing for anxiety is fake news. It just fuels us, right? And if you're noticing that you're, scrolling at night in bed and reading the news, and then you're having a hard time sleeping, right? Those things are connected. So really making sure, especially before bed, that you're not taking in too much news is a good self-care technique as well. Most of us avoid anxiety. Like we have a natural response to avoid things that make us anxious. That's a natural response. So things that we're worried about, we're just going to avoid. So if you're worried about catching the virus, you might then not go outside, or you may not go anywhere or interact with others. And that can become a problem, right? So avoidance makes anxiety worse. So that's just a tidbit. If you're afraid of spiders, avoiding spiders and going anywhere near spiders or talking about spiders or looking at pictures of spiders makes the fear worse. So you want to expose yourself to things that you're afraid of, but in a very gradual way, right? We don't throw people who are afraid of water into the deep end of a pool and yell at them to swim, right? But we might go by the pool, we might put our foot in the water, we might, sit on the side of the pool in our clothes for a while, right? And you can build up, and that's how we treat anxiety actually, is what we call gradual exposure. So you start with something that is easier and you make your way up to something that might be a lot harder for you. And our kids we treat anxiety the same in kids. It's just a little bit more playful and a little bit more fun. Yes, Chris.
You can probably hear one of my daughters crying in the background. Often, at least in my experience, you can have different family members with different risk aversions or appetite, including in relation to, the quarantine and whatnot. And I guess, how do you, somebody had asked, how do you manage it when another family, there are different views on what is acceptable to do and whatnot. But how do you manage that inside your family? I can imagine there are kids that have different views on it as well.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of conflict in families. And we are seeing the rate of consultations for divorce actually going up right now from spending a lot of time in the same house with your partner. But also I think it's around these kinds of major conflicts that are causing a lot of issues in families. We're seeing a lot of that. And I think like anything else you might disagree with, it's a question of really sitting down, understanding, listening, validating both sides, and coming up with some kind of middle ground that, both sides might need to move a little bit to find some kind of compromise about what might be acceptable and comfortable enough, right? So I think that's true for anything you might be having a conflict about or disagreement about. It's really understanding the perspective of each side and coming up with, and again, not when you're in the red zone, but when you're in the green zone, can you sit down and can you have a conversation that is calm about what are you worried about, what might happen, and then listening and validating, and then offering your side, and then being able to come to some kind of compromise. Because in this case, we're talking about a family, and both parents might have very different views about what they're comfortable with in exposing their kids, and that does require some compromise, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, you're welcome. So anxiety. So actually I have this here. I thought I'd show it while it's right in front of me. I'm going to show you. So one of the things we do with kids a lot is glitter jars. I have this here because I made one with a 7-year-old the other day, which I've never done virtually. And she spilt the glitter all over her house. I felt so bad because I couldn't help watching through the screen. I'm like, no. Anyway. But if you take a jar, and this is great, even teenagers love this. Actually, I made one for my dad recently, my stepdad, he has dementia, and I made one for him, and he just loves sitting and staring at it. So you put water and then clear glue, a lot of clear glue in here, and glitter. And basically you shake it up, and as you kind of watch the glitter settle, it's very soothing and kind of calming as you kind of breathe deep breaths. This is a great tool for kids of all ages to help soothe and calm them. There's also apps where they do that. You shake your phone and then you watch the glitter come down. This is a little bit more fun, and then it's a craft project also. But I'm finding a lot of success in using glitter jars with kids. You also want to make sure that the timing about talking about what they're worried about isn't right before bed. Right, having a nice calm routine before bed to kind of stop the mind, because most humans, the worries come up when you're lying in bed at night and you're not occupied and whatnot. And so you want to make sure that you're having this conversation about worries at another time in the day when the kids are not as likely to get worked up and then not be able to sleep. Because if they're not sleeping enough, the anxiety gets worse too, because we don't have access to all of our resources to cope with it. So if kids bring up a lot of worries at night, sometimes I'll ask them, like, either just write them down and put them in a worry jar and close the jar, or write them in a journal or whatever, put them out on paper, and you put them away, and you like schedule a time to sit and read through the worries. So sometimes just getting it out of your head and putting it down on paper is enough to feel better for now, because you got it out. But then you kind of find a time when you're calm and you're in the green zone to kind of go back and read through what you're worried about. Some of those things you will no longer be worried about, they've passed. And then the things that come up over and over again become things maybe that need more attention. But that's a good tool too, and I often make worry jars with kids and decorate the jar and whatever, and then we put them inside. That's just a little tip. So maybe this leads really nicely actually into when should I get help? When should I worry? When is this not just like normal reaction and adaptation to COVID and what we're living through right now? Where should I go for resources? How can I find help? You guys are great in government. You're really well set up for some pretty amazing supports. In fact, you have the best supports in the city as employees in terms of accessing good care and whatnot. So if you're worried about your child or yourself, honestly, I'll throw that in there too, because if you're the pillar. So if you're not coping well, you make sure to get some support. There's no shame in seeking help. I think that, I'm hoping more and more we're seeing less stigma here. This is a really hard time. And if you were already struggling before the pandemic, chances are things are a lot harder now. So it's a really good time to seek help. And we have all kinds of free resources available. You have employment benefits and EAP that you can access. but also a lot of support is happening online. Almost exclusively psychologists and social workers are working through virtual therapy, and all the research is showing it's just as effective as face-to-face therapy, except for really young kids, because that's really hard to do virtually. But for everybody else, it's really working. So seeking some of that support is really important. But when should we worry? When is it no longer kind of typical reaction? So if you're noticing in your child or yourself, either in your thoughts or your feelings or your behaviors, there's what we call the triple P. So 3 Ps to look for. One is problematic. So it's causing problems. So you're either not coping well, you're not sleeping well, you're not able to be productive at all, you're feeling hard to get out of bed, hard to take care of yourself or do anything really. So problematic. Persistent. So we all have bad days and we have bad hours and bad minutes. But if you're feeling, or your child is feeling persistently bad day after day for more days than not, that's a sign that this is perhaps bigger and a bigger problem. And pervasive. Pervasive is really important. So that means it's not happening with just, in one person in one setting, but it's happening perhaps in different settings with different people. So if you find you're really irritable with your spouse, but you're fine hanging out with your friends and all that, then maybe that's less of an issue. But if you're finding that you're actually not getting much joy out of interacting with anybody, or doing activities that you used to find really enjoyable that suddenly have less joy, those are examples of things that perhaps are a sign that it would be helpful to seek support. And sometimes, a lot of places are doing like consultations almost, where it's like a check-in, and we can evaluate in an hour really and give you advice and tips. It doesn't have to be a 20-session treatment, right? So there's a lot of youth that I'm seeing where the parents are worried and they want me to just kind of check in. How is my youth doing? And it's maybe one session, and I can kind of, okay, no, this is more than what I would expect, or this is actually causing me more worry than just a normal response. And here's some resources or things you can do. So yeah, Chris, do you have a question, or is the chat?
Yeah, just one question, and thank you very much for that. The flag about reaching out and getting help, and that it could be something that's quite easy to do and doesn't have to be a prolonged thing. The question is actually about the situation in the United States with the rioting, and not just the rioting, of course, the protests and whatnot. How do you ease your children's worries about the recent events in the United States and what's going on? And actually, for some of us diplomats, some of us have Black children, they can be particularly concerned, and teenagers can be angry. So any sort of tips you might have there would be really helpful.
I feel like we could do 2 hours just on that. That's a big one. I think the most important thing is to talk about it at a developmentally appropriate level. Very important. And I think it's true for any child. Every child needs to be having these conversations with their parents, regardless of what color they are, because we're all in this together and we're all supposed to support each other, right? And be kind. So they know the language of bullying. They know it from school, and acceptance and tolerance of people that are different. So I think that kind of conversation can start there, and then go into kind of tying in what it is we're seeing and what it is that we're hearing, and they're learning a lot. Canadian schools are doing a good job with really learning about Indigenous history in a way that I certainly didn't learn growing up. I think has changed a lot. I've been very impressed with the Ontario curriculum and how they're talking about it and addressing it. And so they're sensitive already to some of this stuff, and I think can be tied into that kind of conversation as well. There are lots of great resources online, great suggestions of books. If you go to a credible source of a professional who's weeded through and provided a good list of resources for how to talk to your kids about this, that would be a good place to go to get kind of tools to help maybe you with the conversation, because sometimes it's harder for us and more uncomfortable for us than it is for our kids, right? Because we're not always sure how to bring this up or how to talk about it. but it's really important that they have these conversations openly. And I think that, again, I wouldn't discriminate based on any race. I think everybody needs to have this conversation openly with their kids, and you can tie it into things that are already part of their language because of what they're learning at school. And certainly if they were in school right now, they would be talking about this, right? So that's unfortunate, and that is something that falls on us. I mean, hopefully we'd be having these conversations anyways with our kids, but I know that's not true for everybody, but I do think that that's important piece that we pick up at home. Yeah,
very much. Thank you.
Okay. So I guess I have some kind of conclusion or some take homes here, and then maybe if I'm happy to stick around if there's any more questions. I think at the end of the day, during this time, I think, again, is be kind to yourself. You know, if at the end of the day your kids watch TV for more hours than you would normally be comfortable with, and they didn't get out of their pajamas, and they didn't eat super healthy, and they didn't get any work done, you know, it's okay. You know, not every day has to be perfect. Not every day has to meet all those milestones, right? Again, that schedule is meant to be something that can be flexible depending on your needs too. If you have a deadline and that means your kids that day have to watch a lot of TV, make it fun. Put a tent up, you know, put a tent up in the living room and say, you know what, guys, today you're going to have a TV day. It's going to be super fun. You can watch 3 movies in a row, whatever, you know, and then you get your work done, and that's fine. Your kids are not going to suffer. They're going to remember, well, that was kind of fun. Like, it's different than norm, right? We had popcorn for lunch and we got to sit in a tent to watch a movie. Like, whatever it takes to get you through that. Again, at the end of the day, when all of this time is over, it's going to be very interesting to see what your kids are not going to remember that you think they're going to remember. They will not remember the details maybe of what was said or what they did, but they're going to remember how they feel, how they felt, right? They're going to remember if they felt loved, if they felt validated, if they felt safe, if they felt accepted. And that would be because, for the most part, we were able to stay calm. And in moments where we couldn't stay calm, we at least came back on it, right? Because, again, we're not going to stay calm all the time. But if we have a moment where we lose it and we don't stay calm, can we go back? Can we connect with the kid again, our child, and have a conversation with our child about what happened and how you're sorry for the way that maybe you reacted or what you might have said, and reconnect and hug it out, right? It's repairing. That's very important, right? Repairing when we have fails, that's key. It's not the failure that's important, it's the repairing that's important. And again, if you think about it, like, think about the stories, you know, that you might tell your grandkids someday, right? About what you lived through and with their parent. And I think it's a great time to have kids as part of their curriculum, right? Like, do like a COVID time capsule. There's lots of PDF kind of documents you could find online that kids can fill out on their own, with how they felt and things they remember and things that stands out to them as particularly fun or particularly hard right now. And recording some of that, I think is a great exercise. At my kids' school, they're writing letters to themselves about what it was like this year, and then they're going to lock it up and give it back to them when they're in their last year of high school. The sort of idea, kind of cute. And again, I think we'll be surprised at what comes out of these letters in terms of what actually is they're taking home, what they're actually finding important. So again, some of the take homes, like, connect before you direct, super important. Self-care, be kind to yourself, forgive yourself, don't be too hard on yourself, let things go when you need to. It's okay. It's not, you're going to get back to normal eventually, right? So all of these things that are important, like how much screen time and how much you mediate that, or you supervise it, will all come back. Keeping a schedule and making sure you stay connected, right, yourself, that you get that emotional connection somewhere, is really, really important during this time. And again, at the end of the day, always choose connection over anything else for safety, right? So everybody feels loved and everybody feels safe. Pick your battles, right? Not everything's worth fighting. Yeah, just be kind to yourself, I think, is all I can say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
You're
before
welcome.
we wrap up, are there any other questions that anybody would like to pose directly to Dr. Sullivan? So we have quite a large number of messages here, Carolyn, of thanks to you for the presentation. saying how incredibly useful it's been, and thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences as well. And so I can only second and third and fourth that. This has really been fantastic. And it's funny, it's easy to read something, you know, on the internet, or even a mental health product that's shared with, you know, from your employer, but to hear it directly from somebody like yourself really makes a difference and gives us a chance to think things through. We had our departmental mental health champion on the call as well, and so I've already been talking to him about how we can make sure that as many people in our department benefit. I'll send you these messages to you separately, but once again, thank you so much. I'm going to go downstairs and prepare some craft dinner for my daughters and not feel guilty about it. And
Good for you. Good for you.
And I hope to bump into you in the neighborhood. But thank you again so much.
You're very welcome. Take care, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.